Hi, everybody. So I wish I could say I could see you, but I can actually see some familiar faces. So lovely to be here at Running Remote. And this is my third time, and it's great to be with a whole bunch of people who have the same mindsets about sort of offering more options and opportunities and flexibility to more people. So I'm very excited to be here and to be introducing. There's supposed to be someone. Okay, great. So, come on, guys, girls. We have Hebba Youseff, Manar Morales, and on screen we have Kristen Parisi. So I am Sophie Wade, the founder of Flexcel Network. I am a workforce innovation specialist. I focus on human-centered leadership with multi-generational teams working distributed ways. And now I would like to, Manar, please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Manar Morales, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Diversity and Flexibility Alliance. We are a group of organizations that are committed to creating human-centered workplaces at the intersection of diversity, flexibility, and well-being. And then I'm also the author of The Flexibility Paradigm, which came out on January 2nd.
Hi, I'm Hebba Youseff. Oh, that's really loud. I can really hear myself. I am the Chief People Officer at Workweek. We're a creator-led media company, and I am also the founder and creator of a brand called I Hate It Here. It's a workplace newsletter, podcast. I have a virtual event series. Thank you to whoever's saying, yay, I love you.
And how many people does that go out to?
155,000. And
nice.
I'm stressing already. Yeah, stressing already about tomorrow's newsletter. So I write about workplaces, how to make them better, and how to build workplace cultures that actually scale. And then by day, I'm still the Chief People Officer at my company, dealing with anything from recruiting to culture to, I don't even know, onboarding, everything in HR.
And Kristen.
Hello. Oh, wow, that's funny. The feedback is, I can hear myself talking and it's very weird. I apologize. I'm a senior reporter over at Morning Brew. I cover all things DEI in the workplace. So my job has been very busy lately, to say the least.
Okay, so DEI is in a different place than it was only just a few months ago. I will say for this discussion, I would like it to be as non-political as possible. The idea is to be focused on how we move forward in the most productive way possible to create the work environments that are good for everybody. At the same time, I think that it is important to understand where we are and why we are here. So what I'd like each one of you to do, please, is just give your understanding of why we are here and some of whatever historical elements you think are important to be sharing at this moment.
How we got to where we are, right? That was the question. We built a lot of processes around a system that's based in systemic racism. And we are getting to the point where we had to acknowledge that the systems that were in place didn't necessarily support everyone. And so when I think of DEI and where we stand today, I think it's still undoing a lot of that work and trying to actively build processes, systems, embracing things that we might not otherwise, to actually build a workplace that people, regardless of your race, gender, demographic data, whatever, can be successful.
Manar.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of different ways to answer that question, because I certainly think there's questions to be reflected, Hebba, as you pointed out, sort of where we are in the evolution, and there always has been an evolution, right? If we think about how it got started to the arc of how diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging has evolved, it has continued to evolve. But I think importantly, it is for each organization to also ask themselves as to where they are today on their own journey, and what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to them ultimately? Because I think it's different for every organization, and how each organization has gotten there is also different. And so making sure that in this time, organizations are not being reactive, but are being intentional, I think is really important.
And Kristen, what is your take on where we are here?
Yeah, so, I think there's a lot of reasons how we kind of got here. Country's been around for a couple hundred years, and throughout that time, there's been not only systemic racism, there's been a lot of ableism, homophobia, misogyny, and that's all kind of we've been trying to push back on that for a few decades now, between the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, a lot of work for equality, and organizations have tried to incorporate not only the laws but their own values. And what we've seen in the last 2 years is a pushback by some who believe that equality is oppression. And especially since 2023, we've seen a lot of folks who are on the right end of the spectrum who believe that DEI initiatives are wrong. Some believe that they are illegal. And we've seen an administration who is using DEI as a bit of a rallying cry right now for their base. And in part because of that, we are now seeing organizations pull back from commitments that they've made, not just in the last 5 years, but since the 1990s. So that's that's just a very tiny snippet of how we got to where we are.
So for me, when I think about some of that and talking to a lot of different people, because my work, which is about a lot to do with empathy, and empathy and inclusion are obviously very closely related, and trying to understand each single person. So there have been, a friend of mine brought a concept which I thought was quite interesting, which I wanted to share with you, about what's called the Overton window. And that is the concept of the window of discourse in popular sort of mainstream population, which people are comfortable with. And so I thought that was a sort of interesting way to think about or frame where we have been. Maybe that window had moved too far forward for the mainstream population. It may have moved back now sort of too far backwards. There's been sort of the swing from one way to the other. Does that make sense? Is that a way that you think can be useful to frame it as we think about the learnings of where we are now? What can we learn about what has happened in recent history, the last 2, 3, 4 years, so that as we learn to think about where we are now to move forward?
I mean, I think right now there's a lot of misperceptions around what diversity actually means, what does equity mean, and what does inclusion mean, and what does belonging mean in organizations. And I think what I always am talking about with whether it's our members or who I'm consulting with or executive committees is to say, what exactly does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you within your organization? And what is it not? So when we were leading groups of people right now, and we lead a lot of chief diversity officers right now, is one of the questions we always ask is, what is this time making possible for you as an organization, right? Because we can all be disheartened by what is happening on the political landscape, especially for people who are committed within this work, whether you're a leader within an organization or it's your role actually to be a chief diversity officer within your organizations, is that in chaos, there's always opportunity and there's possibility. And when I've posed that question to a lot of people, they'll say, you know what, actually, what this has made possible for us as an organization is to clear up a lot of the misconceptions that exist out there, especially even within our own organization, about what exactly does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, and what does it not mean.
Can you share some of that? Because that's something that's come up with all three of you in our conversations, like to share some of the range of what it means and why there has been so much confusion and disagreement and contrarianism.
Do you want me to? So I think it's similar to the flexibility conversation, frankly, right? We at the Alliance have been, when I founded the Alliance, it was around what is the intersection between diversity, flexibility, and well-being. And I will say that just the way that there are many organizations who will say flexibility doesn't work for us, versus organizations who say we are thriving, many of you in this audience, right? We are thriving with flexibility and it means a lot to us. That similar debate is happening within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. In other words, people are just getting it wrong sometimes. And so I always say it's not a failure of flexibility when people are saying that, it's a failure of implementation. It's not a failure of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a failure of the way it's been implemented in some organizations or the way that people have sort of hijacked what it means to serve a purpose that is not actually what it is intended for.
I'd love to hear what you, Hebba, what you think on that same exact question, as well as giving some examples, because you do hear from a lot of HR executives in terms of how they're experiencing that themselves, and where it has been done well and has not been implemented in the way that's been effective.
Yeah, look, I think these are like interesting and complicated things to figure out as an HR person, and not every HR person gets training in everything, right? Like, we have a very wide scope job, and you have to think about laws being passed. I'm not a legal expert, I don't have a law degree, but I'm looking at the laws being passed thinking like, how do I adhere to these as a company? And then we also have the very distinct battle of managing executive personalities that may or may not actually believe in the thing that we are trying to do. So we're seeing a lot of HR leaders, and I'm hearing from them directly like, oh, I believe in these things. I want to keep our diversity programs going. I want to support our ERGs. I want to make sure that we support parents, people of color, all these different things. But my CEO doesn't want to do it anymore. And we look at companies like Costco that told their shareholders, absolutely not, we're going to continue what we're doing. And then we look at Target that said, we don't really want to do that anymore. We're going to scale it back. Facebook. So a lot of HR leaders are put in this position where morally and ethically they think this work is important. It's critical, from flexibility to belonging. We see all the ways that it's intertwined, like the more diverse a company is, potentially the more profitable it is. You bring more ideas to the table, you build more belonging, but then they're hearing from their executive team, we don't want to do that stuff anymore. And so they're tasked with, how do I actually push this work forward and also like demystify it for people who might not actually understand the work, and ourselves where we might not actually also be experts. So it's a very interesting place to be as an HR leader right now, because we're hearing outside thoughts that I don't think I agree with personally. That's my personal belief. And then we have to stand in our own organizations with 2 feet on business saying, we are doing this work still, to potentially leaders that might not want to do the work. And then you look at the data, like less than 4% of funding globally, venture capital funding, goes to women and underrepresented groups. So we're already not funding companies where there is diversity at that level. And we're saying an administration that's saying, demonizing it essentially. And then we are standing there trying to defend our work because we know how important it actually is for the employees day to day. And the business is also seeing outcomes. Costco saw a surge. Target saw less foot traffic for 12 straight weeks in a row. So it's an interesting time. I don't want to say like we know correlation is not causation, but it's an interesting time seeing what companies are willing to still defend what they're trying to do, and others that are saying, actually, this isn't for me anymore.
And thank you. And Kristen, from your perspective, you're talking to so many people in this space who can't necessarily speak and be sort of reported on the record. What are some of the insights that you can share, obviously anonymously, as well as giving some names of companies where you see them really trying to change the narrative or reframe it slightly so that they can move forward in a more visible, grounded way in this particular environment?
Very loaded. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is companies trying to do, myself and I think a few others have been saying, is like DEI on the DL, where it's like, okay, well, we're not gonna put it out there because we don't want to bring attention to the fact that we're still practicing, inclusion, thoughtful DEI, diversity initiatives, but we're still doing it because we want our employees to feel valued, to feel like they can show up as their authentic selves. And I think that's one of those fine lines that a lot of companies are trying to walk. Some companies are saying, hey, we're still moving forward with the programming, but maybe we're going to call it something else. I think one of the companies that's done it in a way that's been somewhat transparent while also getting some ire is Walmart. Walmart has really, for years now, been a big supporter of diversity initiatives, not just with hiring and workplace policies, but with influencer relations, with marketing, with product development, right? Because at the end of the day, we also have to remember that DEI is not just in an HR function. It's why it's often has its own department, because from what I've heard, a good DEI program is built into every part of the business. And so Walmart did change a few things. It changed what it calls its programming. So it calls it, I believe, the Office of Belonging now. And part of this was because of their conversations that they had with right-wing activist Robbie Starbuck. However, beyond the headlines, Walmart is staying committed to its ERGs, to working with different organizations. I believe they still, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe in February they still had their line for Black History Month. All of those things, we're continuing to see many companies like Walmart and Amazon change a few things, but overall stay true to what they've been doing for years.
And so when we're looking at how people can move forward, as you said, with Walmart framing it slightly differently, we have a number of companies who are changing it from DEI to just inclusion, or talking about an inclusive culture. How much can that make a difference to be walking a fine line that's going to be true to what employees need, the general population of employees, as well as dealing with the atmosphere, the external environment that we're dealing with? There was a comment that I think you made to me, Hebba, about if a company is having a problem with it, probably the DEI initiatives were performative anyway. Can we talk to that in light of this?
Yeah, if you're going back on your DEI initiatives because an administration is demonizing equity, inclusion, and diversity, like, your work was just performative to begin with. You should have been building it in. Thank you. You should have been building it in every single thing you do. And, like, candidly, I could care less what you call the work. I care more about the work getting done. So after all of the things started happening in early January, I had an employee come to me and be like, hey, are we going to change anything that we do? And I was like, why would we? I literally was like, what do you mean? We're not going to change anything. We're going to keep doing the things we are doing. We're going to keep building infrastructure that supports all of you. We're going to keep looking at how do we create a place where everyone feels welcome. And that's what's important to me. Like, I think the words diversity, equity, and inclusion get a bad rep, or they do now. And I'm like, fine, give it a bad rep. That's not going to stop me from doing the work. Like, I don't care what we call it, and I feel like that's a very privileged take I can have, because I have executives that support the work being done. They belong to underrepresented groups. They want to see a better world than the world that we currently live in our organization.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you're saying. I will also say, though, when we have organizations that, I shouldn't say though, I will, but when we have organizations come to us, and I often will have leaders, and we work a lot with executive committees, who will say to us, what should we do? And I would always say, before I can tell you what you need to do, I need to know who you are. Because what matters is your values, what matters is your culture. And certainly in this environment, and I'm a former litigator, so I come from the legal world, of saying compliance is important, but there's a difference between compliance and culture. And so absolutely, should you do an audit of what you're doing? By all means, you should do an audit of what you're doing. But also, don't over-index into the idea where we're going way past compliance and we're disrupting culture from a perspective of we're no longer thinking about our values, we're not thinking about who we are. And so I will say doing that work is really important. And what I think right now has made possible for all organizations is do the culture work right now. Figure out what you stand for, figure out who, and figure out also, what did you get wrong? Like, where did you go wrong in some of what you were doing, and how might you do this better? How can we do this as an opportunity, I think, for all of organizations and companies to look at where do we need to go, right? We continue to stand and believe in this as a core concept and as a core value of us as an organization. So how might we be better rather than using this as a time to retract?
And how do you feel, Hebba, in terms of the conversations you've had with many HR folks, and from your perspective in terms of thinking about where things weren't done in the best way possible that may have helped lead to where we are, or just need to be rethought through when people are doing those audits, what have you found that they are discovering about, look, we need to do this differently, and what does that look like?
Oh, I mean, so many things can be done differently.
The top five.
I can nerd out about onboarding for like a full hour. Like performance management, could talk about that for 5. But I think we're at a conference called Running Remote, and I think that the remote work is a very interesting discussion because the flexibility piece actually helps foster inclusion. Like, people have lives outside of work. People are caregivers, they're parents, they're taking care of aging parents. They might have an autoimmune condition or an invisible disease. They might feel safer at home than at work. And so I think, like, when you look at, we want to foster a most diverse culture or more inclusion, look at like what you're saying about return to office or remote work. If your company is standing by it, it means they want to support potential lifestyles that don't involve being able to go to work 9 to 5 every day. I think that's just like a big audit that a lot of HR people are doing. They're hearing from their executives, we want everyone back in the office, but they've seen the data that says, like, people from every other group feel better working with flexibility, having flexible options. So I think that's like a big focus area right now, the return to work conversation and how to foster an actual remote and hybrid culture.
Kristen, I know that you have much to say about the RTO situation and how important offering remote options, offering flexibility is. I'd love you to expand on that.
Yeah, this is more from, I guess, a personal standpoint than a standpoint as a journalist. I will be transparent. I have a physical disability. Going into the office every single day is taxing on my body. I used to work in New York City, and navigating the subway system as a person with a physical disability was near impossible. Not only that, but incredibly expensive. I think a lot of these leaders are it appears like they're making these decisions without consulting their employees and saying, what do you need for our company to remain inclusive? I think of the working mothers who at some financial institutions have been told with not much notice, hey, we expect you back in the office 5 days a week. Well, they may have 2 or 3 little kids at home and they had a nanny for, and now all of a sudden they have a 2-hour commute to do, and they need to find a different nanny. And so now that nanny is out of a job, has to find a new job, and they have to find a caregiver who can work with their new schedule. And so, and I apologize, this is a bit of a tangent, but I also think it's incumbent on leaders to think about the ripple effect of these RTO decisions that they're making on behalf of their employees without consulting their employees. And it sounds like sometimes that they're not even consulting their HR leaders.
I want to talk about just because I think in the way that we're also implementing it, it's important to think about inclusion, right? So if I talk about the fact that for flexibility to work, you have to be intentional. It doesn't work by default, it works by design. But you also have to be inclusive, and then you have to be iterative. So even in hybrid workplaces, as you allow for flexibility to happen within workplaces, who's getting opportunities? Are you engaging in proximity bias? How are you running your meetings? Like, it goes just beyond the fact that we are offering it. And when you offer it, who's taking it, who's using it, and who's not? So we talk about the fact that you have to de-gender, you have to de-parent, and you have to destigmatize flexibility to work. Can't be just seen as caregivers, it can't just be seen for women or for mothers. It has to be seen for everybody, but then it's not just enough in terms of the policy. It does actually have to go beyond that in your day-to-day, in everything that you do. How are you running an inclusive, flexible work environment?
Absolutely. Kristen, thanks for sharing that. And in fact, my work in workplace flexibility started in 2011 because of my kids who were saying, can't you get a half job? Because I never saw them. So I started on this journey then, and actually got a half job for a bit. I was working 3 days a week, and then I decided I needed to focus on workplace flexibility for everybody, not just women, because otherwise, everybody deserved flexibility, period. I mean, it was kind of like as simple as that. So what do we do when we have an interesting contradiction with Jamie Dimon, who is not a proponent of remote working, as we all know well, but he does support DEI. He does support those efforts. How do we deal with leaders who have some kind of, whether it's that way or the other way, deal with trying to help leaders, team leaders or company leaders shift how they're thinking to understand the connection and the sort of the fabric that this is made up of?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that goes to what has diversity, equity, and inclusion made possible for us as an organization. So then you start to list out and say, it's a larger umbrella. One of the things I think Kristen and Hebba, were saying as well, which is the idea that this has been a siloed conversation often, right? We had people who were leading diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they were responsible for everything, as opposed to the fact that these conversations need to be across the organization and everybody needs to be responsible. So when you look at your flexibility policies, you say that's a DEI initiative, really. That does actually impact diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you look at your leave policies, that impacts how much leave you give for somebody. We talk about the fact you need gender-neutral leave policies that remove primary and secondary designations, because I think that's the only way that you create an inclusive environment when you have that. And so, but that can get under HR, and I'm like, no, that's actually a conversation around bringing all of those conversations together. And the last thing I will say is one of the things that I think this has made possible is moving the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion back into executive committees caring about it and having to make a decision about it. Hopefully when they're making that decision, they're being inclusive in who's in the room when they're thinking about it. And I think the companies that are getting it right are bringing a much wider group into the room to actually talk about it.
Yeah. All of that, yes. And sorry, you said Jamie Dimon in the beginning, and if that man has no haters, it's me. I'm dead. I respect him so much. He's done so much. Okay, he recently said everyone's coming back to the office 5 days a week. It's because they built this like really nice building in downtown Manhattan, and he was like, I need these people to use this building. But he basically was like, that's it, you all have to come back, mandated it. And then on the other side, he was like, but I still believe, like separately in a different conversation was like, I believe in DEI, we're not walking back our commitments. My only thing about that is you can't, they're just like in conflict a little bit. And I like would encourage any of you to challenge me on this because I would love that conversation. They're in conflict. Like you cannot say I care about diversity, equity, and inclusion and then say, but all of you have to come to the office and physically work in this space exactly the same way. That is very opposite from what that actually means. And so I think it's interesting watching these business leaders kind of talk out of both sides of their mouths. And some of them are being really hard about return to office, but then trying to be like, but we care about inclusion. And I just think like you can't say you care about something and then not actually back it up with your actions. I hate you.
How much do you
find? I think this is,
go for it.
I'm so sorry. I think that it's kind of important to acknowledge the reality that many of these businesses who do implement a mandatory return to office there's something deeper going on, right? So,
For sure.
you know, if you look at some of these businesses, they'll mandate at least a 3-day per week return to office. And then a few months later, they'll have some layoffs. And so I think there's a lot of pressure coming from the outside in and investors for the C-suite to enact certain policies. And so I think it seems like businesses are trying to have this balance of looking tough almost, tough as leaders to have their business go back to where it was in maybe 2021, while also not driving out their key talent and having brain drain, which is then how we get to things like, what is it, revenge RTO, where employees are coming in and they're doing everything they can to make as little time of being in the office as possible because they're so angry at their employer.
Understood. Very well. Point very well taken. There's some interesting data that came out. So in March, NBC, the poll was that 49% of registered voters are against or think that DEI should be eliminated, and 48% of registered voters were for it. However, the most recent Pew data, which came out in April, very recently, 53% of Americans disapprove of actions to end DEI in the federal government. So whether we believe that the tide is turning or that people really have fundamental beliefs that this is not the direction we should be going in, this is not about what we believe, it's about how do companies navigate based on that data. How can they use that data to help persuade their activist investors, their board members, to be moving forward in a way that's going to allow them to create the kind of work environments that every single person on their workforce needs?
Well, what we've been saying all along is, look, I don't think the political landscape matches the talent landscape. And what you need to do is build a workforce for your people. And your people are at the center of your workforce. And so from that perspective, and I'm not talking about whether you have Republicans or Democrats within your workforce. I'm merely talking about what do your people value. And part of one of the things around culture in the work is what do your people value, what do they want? And especially whether it's around flexibility, frankly, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because a lot of the flexibility conversations, too, are also built on the misperceptions or what an executive committee thinks is important, but it's not necessarily a diverse representation of what their people actually want. And it's the same thing if you look at we look less at sort of from a voters or that perspective, but more from, and you know this, right, generationally. Look at what do the generations want. The younger generations value wanting to know about what does your company stand for? Where is it evidence? And more not just from a marketing perspective. I think a lot of the culture work in organizations can be done is done in the marketing department. What are we going to put on our website? What are we going to put on our flyers? But they're not about what are our lived values. What do we actually, not what do we put on our websites, but who are we? What do we expect? What are our non-negotiables? What do we hold people in our organization accountable for? And so part of that is really doing that work, whether it's stay interviews that you do, whether it's looking at exit interviews, whether it's surveying employee engagement data. I think it's really important to start to get to the heart of, hey, this is what our people value, and this is what we hold ourselves accountable to.
Do you ever just look at people and think you should not be asked to participate in a survey? Am I the only person? Sorry. Because that's like literally, as you were reading those stats, I was like, damn, they probably asked the wrong people. Anyways, sorry, sidebar. I think it's a really interesting data point that you take into consideration, like where's the sample size, where they get this data, what city were they in. But if you look at Gen Z is the most demographically diverse generation we've ever had. Like, they represent so many different groups. So if you're looking at your talent, like back to your point, like your talent wants to work alongside people who are also demographically diverse. Like they want to show up and go to work with other people. They want to be challenged with their ideas. They want to push innovation forward. And so I think if you're going to anchor on something, it's like looking at your talent and what they want. Gen Z wants to work in an environment that is representative of their broader communities. They want there to be diversity. They care about the value. They care about people's access to opportunities. And they're going to be the majority of the workforce in 10 to 20 years? Yeah, 20, 30 years. They're going to be in leadership positions. I think we're going to see a lot of changes happen with that generation. They're very vocal. They will leave organizations quickly if they don't think their needs are being met. They don't care. So I think you have to think about what talent are you trying to get, what talent are you trying to keep, and how do you make sure that you can do both those things?
Kristen?
I think there's something to be said perhaps for the right versus wrong and understanding the difference between right and wrong. The civil rights movement did not poll well. There were a lot of people who were against the Civil Rights Act because of that thought of the zero-sum game. Employers are still dealing with that. We are seeing it's very interesting. You speak about Gen Z, and women, Gen Zers, are they're very inclusive minded. They're fairly progressive, and the men are not so much. And I think it may be incumbent on employers to look too at our gender divides and how to make sure that we are including those men who feel left out right now into the equality, into the inclusion conversation. Shoot, there was one more thing that I wanted to point out and I've lost it, so continue on.
Great. We'll come back to it. You remember, just let us know. There's also when it comes to data that is very supportive of why this is so important, how effective have you found that to be at the board level, at the senior executive level? For example, that gender diverse boards are 27% outperform less diverse boards by 27%, and ethnically diverse boards outperform by 13%. Does this data make a difference? And how is that used? Is there other data that you have found that is particularly compelling or particularly meaningful that helps change the conversation?
I mean, I think the business case has long existed, and I do think, though, people have gone beyond it too, right? That at the end of the day, this is about our people. If you believe in diversity, it's about representation. If you believe about equity, it's about opportunity. And if you believe in inclusion, it's about, do people feel valued? Now, does diversity, equity, and inclusion absolutely contribute to the bottom line? Are you better at your decision makers? Are you better at serving your community? Are you better at serving your customer base? Absolutely, but I think at the end of the day, it also comes down to your people and that, who you represent, and do you care about how your people feel like when they come into your organizations or not?
I dream of the day that I don't have to make the business case anymore for DEI. Actively, just my sick fantasy. I just don't want to.
That's why I asked.
I just don't want to make this business case anymore. But I mean, the reality is, some CEOs will want to hear the business case. They will say, "Oh my God, my company could be more profitable if we build a more diverse company. I must do that." That's what motivates them. I think data plays a really good point in storytelling. You're trying to bring someone along for the ride with you. And not everybody is going to agree with everything you believe in, and not everybody's going to want to do the right thing. And I think if you can use that data as an anchor point to tell a story around why we should do this thing, then it's easier to secure the buy-in that you're so desperately looking for.
And I will also say the regrettable losses are big in organizations, right? So who would have walked out of the door when you were talking about your flexibility story? Mine started 23 years ago when I had my first son, and I decided I wanted to go reduced hours and and I was a litigator. And what was I told? What was the narrative being told to me around whether I could do that or not? And that was my sort of individual journey with flexibility. And then women would come up to me and say, I wouldn't have left if I could have done it the way that you did it. And I thought, why can't we create organizations that do that? And so I think it is to find those stories, right? We can talk about the global data all day long, but if we don't make it real for our organizations to say, hey, we were able to bring this person in. We were able to make sure that, our leadership team looked a certain way. We were make sure that this person, by the way, had they gone to a competitor, it would have cost us X. There is a real sort of, in terms of the way that you create your environments, of who are the people that you're able to retain, who are the people that you're able to advance, who are the people that you're able to attract into your organization.
Hebba, what do you say, or what are you writing about to try and help companies and the HR, all these HR professionals who are reading your newsletter multiple times a week, to, in this particular area, to help them navigate this time? There's so much that's going on, and this is obviously, so much of this is changing, and this is a critical piece of it. And what advice do you give them to navigate it on, for their teams, their divisions, and to try and spread that within the company at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the advice that I give in twofold. One, I want to acknowledge the HR person in front of me who's like, has their personal lived experience in this world and is trying to navigate that while also trying to support an entire organization through that. That job, that pressure that you feel every day to like step up and support people it's really hard. Like I'm fighting battles, not now, but in the past I have fought battles behind closed doors for employees, and I think that job is really hard. Like the HR job has a very high burnout level because it is very emotionally taxing work, because you're seeing yourself in almost everything. And so the best advice I could give to any HR person trying to navigate this world is also take space for yourself, because this is really hard work, and you'll be able to better serve your organization if you can take care of yourself first. And then when it comes to the organization, it's about anchoring in the values. If your values say that we're inclusive, but everything you do is in conflict, that is a data point right there. Like, we are trying to build something that lives these values. Okay, and the last piece of advice I would give, just a third prong, some people are never gonna get it. Some people don't want me in the room. Some people don't want me reflected on boards. They don't want me in a C-suite position. They will look me dead in the eyes and tell me I'm too young, too loud, too opinionated to do anything that I do. And that is okay. I mean, they're wrong, but like, that's okay. Those people are always going to exist, right? You have to remember that like the person isn't necessarily the enemy, but those people out there, they're gonna want you to fail because you don't look like them. And that job is also really hard.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about, yes, love that, is we don't actually have to get to common ground on this. It's similar to flexibility, right? I think we spend a lot of time trying to get to common ground on conversations that need to just get to higher ground. And the higher ground is, what do you stand for as an organization? What do you tolerate? What are you willing to do? And if somebody wants to be in that environment, then they have to abide by that sort of higher ground. And we need to get beyond whether I agree with you or not. And so that's one of the things that we have been giving advice on. And then the second one on the individual one, and I'll echo what you're saying, is right now, I will say people who are leading teams around diversity, equity, and inclusion, chief diversity officers, check in on them. I mean, right, like if we think about the arc of what has happened in the past 5 years, people had to deal with COVID and the disruption and lead teams and lead efforts while they were also being impacted by COVID, right? Then we had the murder of George Floyd. Also a very difficult situation where, again, people had to lead in an environment that was incredibly difficult for some people very personally. The disruption of AI, and now we're coming to this. And I feel like no wonder everybody's overwhelmed and exhausted and tired and burned out, right? If you just look at the arc of the past 5 years. So I think that is on the idea of really checking in on your people. On the organization level, we have a framework we call CORE around just even developing your culture and thinking about your culture. And the first one is, who do you represent? And who do you represent isn't just your client and customers. Who do you represent are your employees. Who do you represent are the communities you choose, the impact that you have. We talk about the fact of what's your origin story? A lot of this goes back to organizations having to think about their mission. What were they founded on? What were the principles they were founded on? If you listen to the CEO of Marriott when he said, "Oh, I'm not sure what we were supposed to do, but let me go back to our origin story," and suddenly that gave me the answer to what we should be doing, right? R is about your roadmap. Where are you going? What are your strategic initiatives, right? How does this all relate to that? And then E is your ethos, right? Like, what do you stand for? And I talked already a lot about that. But even giving people that culture framework to work through, I think is a really tangible way to figure out what should we do moving forward.
Thank you. And Kristen, from a journalist perspective or a personal perspective, looking at the same arc, this 5-year arc, what do you see, because you're looking so broadly and looking from a historical perspective as well, in terms of where you think we are and where companies can go?
I'm actually not sure, and I wish that I could come here and say, oh, I think this is where we're going, but everybody I talk to right now is kind of trying to figure this out as they go along, more than what I've heard in the past. And even, when we talked about just the terminology that we're using, if we even call it DEI moving forward. A year ago when I was having these conversations, it was pretty staunchly that the scholars were saying, you know what, we need to keep this language, because if we don't, then we're kind of ceding defeat. And now that conversation is shifting, and I'm still unsure about where we are. I'm unsure about where we're going. I think that at least when we think about it from a remote work perspective and that type of inclusivity, it feels like we've gone back sometimes in some companies decades. You look at what IBM has done in the last year, and they've told employees who worked remotely for 20 years that they're expected to go into the office now. So I don't know what the next even month looks like.
Can I just, one of the things I do want to point out is that your people are watching. Everything I say to a CEO or I say to a leader, and the same thing I said during COVID, is your people are watching. They want to know how you're going to respond. They want to know what you stand for. They are going to remember this come years later. And I think during this time, your people are going to remember, whether it's 4 years later and there's a different administration and suddenly you go backwards, they're going to remember that too.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we take questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, you have to go into the app. You click on the live. It says live session, and then that's where you put the questions in. It's not so you have to do those multiple steps. So a question that I always like to ask on my podcast is, what haven't I asked you that I should have done? Hebba.
I'm being put on the spot. I don't know. I don't think I have a good answer to that question, to answer your question. I'm sorry, I don't. Do you?
Okay.
You asked?
That I should have done.
What?
Or that you would, something that you would like to share that you haven't had the opportunity to. Perhaps it's slightly more tangential from the line of conversation we've been having.
I will say that culture matters. I do say, and maybe I've already said that, but I do, in the same way that I think flexibility is not a policy, it's a culture change, it's not a policy shift. Right. It's the same thing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's really not about your policies. It really is about your practice. It's about how do you align your sense of purpose with a set of principles, with a set of your policies, with your practices and your people, right? How do you bring all of those conversations together? And so I think that is an important piece of this, is really kind of aligning all of those things to say, this is what we're talking about and this is what we're not talking about.
Okay, now I have an answer.
Fantastic.
Here's a thought, I have an answer. Okay, we're at like a remote conference, right? I just thought you cannot just instantly assume that remote or hybrid work is the most inclusive work out there, because you have to put a lot of processes in place to actually make it inclusive. You can't be like, we're an inclusive company, but everybody has to have their video on. Like, that's not, what if somebody's doing something in the background? What if they're caregiving? What if they're taking care of a child? Like, what if I just don't want to have my video on because I'm tired? Like, there are aspects to remote work. You have to design with intentionality so that it actually is more inclusive.
Thank you. And Kristen?
The big thing that I keep coming back to that I wish every leader would ask themselves is, when was the last time I talked to my employees? Like, talk to the people that work for my company, and what do they feel about this? Going back to the Marriott CEO, he said when he made that statement about DEI that he didn't think was anything too big. He got 40,000 responses from his employees. So I just think that companies are making these choices without talking to their workers, and instead they're engaging outside folks who think that they should have an outsized influence on business practices and on employment practices.
I will say there was one thing I featured a CEO in my book, and what he used to do during COVID, he did something. He doesn't drink coffee, so he called them Mountain Dew chats because he drinks Mountain Dew and not coffee. But across his company organization, he brought together groups of 10 people to have a chat with him as a CEO, right? And he said he continued that practice post-COVID. And I said, what was the biggest benefit? And he said, unintended consequences. He said, based upon bringing together 10 people across the organization in various positions, I would just talk about what we were doing, I would hear from them, and I would find out about things that we did that had unintended consequences that we never meant to have. And that was a huge value. And I know that since then I have also heard that replicated by a number of different CEOs who do it. But it's a simple way to bring together and understand across the organization how people are impacted.
The one thing I will add too is that, like, I guarantee, I talk to our employees all day long. Honestly, sometimes I wish they would stop talking to me. But like, a lot of HR leaders are talking to their employees every single day, and they are showing up in their executive meeting and saying, this is what our employees want. And I guarantee you, the CEOs are shutting them down. And so I just want to give a nod to like the HR people out there that are advocating for their employees. And I just want all of you to know, like, we might advocate and we might still hear no. And that I think isn't talked about enough, because people will be like, oh, well, you're not talking to the employees. Oh, well, HR didn't do a good job at this initiative. And it's like, behind closed doors, HR is probably saying all the things the employees are saying, but sometimes we are not trusted or respected or believed, and we're like superseded. So I want to call that out, because it's a very real thing that's happening.
Yeah. Thank you. Good, very good point. We have a question or two. Oh, we have a lot of questions. Excellent.
8 minutes.
Well, so
I caught him off guard. Sorry about
wonderful.
that.
Go for it.
This is I'll ask the questions, and then if one or two want to jump in, because I think we got like 5 or 6, so we're going to get rolling. This is from Kate O'Neill. Hebba alluded to this, but how do you think performance management programming should change to support a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment?
Change in performance management programs to be more supportive of DEI.
Performance management needs to be iterative, like it needs to happen every single day. And I think if you were going to change it, it should just be burnt to the ground and rebuilt in a more collaborative and continuous manner, where feedback is not seen as a moment in time, twice a year, once a year annual review. It is seen as something you do every single day with your manager.
I think there are organizational solutions. I think there are individual strategies. I think on the organizational side, we talked about it in the beginning, right, around the fact that unconscious bias does come in to the performance evaluation systems. And so unless you create systems within your organization to say, how are we making sure that we are paying attention to where bias is coming into those performance evaluations, and then how are we training the people who are providing feedback to talk about, we do a lot of this work, is we're training or talking about how does unconscious bias come into play when you're talking about giving feedback, when you talk about written evaluations. Third, you have bias interrupters built into your system where you're having somebody look at your evaluations before they're being delivered to scan for it and actively see how do we make sure that they are being written and delivered in such a way that is free from bias.
Thank you.
Hi, oh my God, you can hear me for sure. Wow, so sorry. First of all, thank you all for doing this. I know too many leaders who are afraid to speak up, to get on stage, or they've been told that they're not allowed to, given the environment. So thank you very much. Manar, a question for you specifically. The phrase illegal DEI gets tossed around a bunch these days. What, if anything's actually changed from a legal landscape that people need to be aware of in the current environment?
Okay, can you repeat the first part of your question?
What has actually changed from a legal perspective that people need to be complying with, that companies need to be complying with?
So I don't practice law anymore. I was like, put the caveat of saying
you are the lawyer on the panel, so I thought
a former lawyer, yes. I'm still a lawyer, I guess. Yeah, I know. So I will say, I'll give the lawyerly answer. Consult legal counsel. But what I will say is it is about what's giving an unfair advantage or opportunity. So it's not about, oh my gosh, we can't have an affinity group. It's about really kind of paying attention to what are the things that are, you have to go back to the Supreme Court case, right? And so talk about that perspective of it and not talk about everything suddenly falling under it. So it's about, is there something that is giving some unfair advantage? I will remind everybody, Title VII is also still the law. In other words, we still can't discriminate on the basis of all of the protected classes. So everybody has to still pay attention to the fact that that hasn't changed.
Nothing is easy to navigate.
Let's see. Have you noticed that the room is full with women? How come men are not more present in both this panel and in the room? Maybe there are some men here.
We got some men allies.
I know.
There are some
I
men
see them.
here.
Let's hear it, felt. No, but I guess the better question is, what role should men play unique to men? Is that kind of one way to think about it?
Kristen, do you want to take this on? What role should men play that is unique to men?
I don't know
this
if there's
area.
one that's unique to men, but I think just like any other policy, right, you have to have men in mind when you're creating your workplace policies. And that's, I think what we're seeing from the data, right, is men are struggling. They're struggling with feeling isolated. They don't have strong friendships the way women do. And there's a loneliness epidemic going on. I think that plays a part in diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And so maybe think about that and make sure that everybody is being included in these conversations.
I mean, I think also paying attention to what rooms are you in and who's not at the table, right? And how do you think about what privilege people have? And I think at some point everybody has privilege, right? It's a different lens of privilege that they might have, but paying attention to, if I have an opportunity to be on this stage, that's a privilege. How do I use that, right? If I have an opportunity to be in a room that others aren't, that's a privilege. How do I use that? Who's on my team? I talk about the fact that every leader should think about the 4 framework of FOR. Who are you giving feedback to? Who are you giving opportunities to? Who are you building relationships with? And who are you not? Who has access, who doesn't? So I think more broadly, every leader needs to be thinking about that.
Every man came from a mother. Like, I would want them to like appreciate our experiences at work. I think like, listen, everyone has their lived experience. Everyone has their perspective that they bring to the table. And when you're thinking about remote work and running a remote company and building the best damn company out there, I think anchoring in and what are all the benefits of including every single person in the conversation, at a seat at the table and in our organization can really bring someone along for the ride with you. It doesn't work if you just walk in and start yelling at men for being men because they have access to privilege. I think it's helping them understand how they can use that privilege to build a better environment and a better company.
Yeah, and from my perspective, in terms of empathy is understanding every single person from their perspective as them in their shoes and trying to understand what they're going through, what they're experiencing. And that holds true for every single person and their context and background. So empathy works. Any other questions?
I think it's about time to wrap up. So instead of another question, maybe a closing thought from everyone?
Closing thought, Kristen? You have a closing thought?
It's a very uncertain time. I think companies are just trying to figure it out, and I have a lot of empathy for everyone who's going through this process right now. That's it. Godspeed.
Everything is interconnected at work. Like nothing just happens in one thing. It actually like shows up across your organization and has residual impact. And so if you're thinking about how do I build a great culture, a great company, it's all really intertwined. Look at, as daunting as it sounds, look at everything across your org. Look at how it all plays together and figure out for you, like, where do you want this organization to go in partnership with your executives, with your culture, and with your values.
I will say that the idea of right now, inclusion is also at the heart of innovation. So all of our organizations that care about innovation and say that's our #1 priority, and innovation isn't about recreating the past, but it is about reimagining the future for one that everybody can thrive.
And I I call myself a realistic optimist, and I do believe that we are incrementally going in the right direction. We may take a step back before we take a couple more steps forward, but I really do believe that that's where we're going. More than anything, because technology is going to take us there, and we don't have any choice. And because that flexible mindset, because that open mindset is absolutely fundamental to how the work is evolving, how business is evolving. And so I do believe that DEI and all these inclusive ways that we need to be thinking and including every single person are going to happen. And with that, I will say thank you so much to Kristen, Hebba, and Manar.
Thank
you
you.
very, very much. And thank you all for your great questions.